Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our second in our series of discussions about women, democracy, and global politics. I'm Nancy Bosker, and I am this fall's Dole Institute Fellow. And graciously, Texas Women's University, where I am launching their Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy, lets me commute to Kansas City and drive to Lawrence once a week. So it's a pleasure to be here again. I want to thank Bill Lacey and Angie and Alex and Caitlin and the team here for setting this up. How many of you were here 2 weeks ago? Oh, good. We have a few new faces, but we like to say that Bill and I have known each other for longer than most students have been alive, or probably longer than your parents have been alive, but we'll just kind of go with that. Okay, well, thank you. Just saying, they could be, child moms. And again, it's such an honor to be selected and to always get to be in this room, since this is where I first cut my teeth on politics, was on the Ford Dole campaign in 1976 when I was all of 19 years old. So I look at some of the posters around here, and this is what my dorm room looked like sophomore year at lovely Otterbein College in Westerville, Ohio, where the next Democratic debate is going to be held. So we have always been a very civically engaged campus. We'll talk to you in a few minutes about our guest next week, but now I'm just so honored that Susan Markham is in the United States long enough that she would fly to Lawrence to visit with us. Susan has a remarkable background. She has been with Emily's List, which is Early Money is Like Yeast. It is a Democratic women's group to help get more women elected to office. She has been with NDI, the National Democratic Institute, where we promote democratic skills overseas, USAID, and now has started a business called Smash Strategies. And she's worked in more than 50 countries, so she has me beat there. But really important things about Susan is she's also from Ohio. She grew up in Worthington, Ohio, which is just a few miles from the Ohio, not just the Ohio State University. We're both Buckeyes fans, and just thrilled. We meant to do the OHIO thing in front of the flag, but we forgot, but maybe afterwards. But today we're going to talk to Susan about gender equity around the world and what's happening and how difficult that is. Because I certainly know here, when I talk about gender equity, most people I know roll their eyes, right? Oh, why are you doing that gender politics again? Why is there a women's campaign school at Yale? And I go, well, because every day is man's campaign school, right? I need to get more women in the mix. And so Susan has been just a key person advising President Obama and being in charge, senior advisor in the Obama administration. And so I'll have her share some of those stories. And before I forget, next week, my guest is going to be Sally Canfield. And Sally is a master at public policy. Her big issue is global health. She, too, has worked in a lot of countries. She has worked with the Gates Foundation, the One Foundation, which is Bono's group. She is now a senior advisor to the Bush Institute for Global Health, but she's also been in senior policy positions with Senator Marco Rubio, President Bush's campaign. So I think this will be a real opportunity when she talks about her work. And two things. One, she calls herself the International Woman of Mystery, because you never know what country that Sally is going to turn up in. You just have to turn on Instagram, and she may be in India today. But the second thing that's really significant about Sally is that Sally was in the room with President Bush and Congressman Tom Ridge right after 9/11. She was part of the original team that launched the Department of Homeland Security. And she was very young when she was doing that. And so she is going to be a real significant guest. But to start with Susan. So Susan, tell us, am I the one that's making some of these clicking noises, do you think, or are we okay with? I'll try not to move. So,
Good luck.
Yes, thank you, I fidget. This one? Okay. All right, good. Thank you. So Susan, one of the things, especially when students come over, is, how did you get to be doing what you're doing today? I mean, you grew up in Worthington, Ohio, which is a suburb of Columbus, and you go to Ohio State. Tell us where this thirst came from to help empower women.
Well, I have to start before that.
Good.
Because even though I was born in Columbus and I graduated from college there, we moved around quite a bit when I was growing up. My dad is an electrical engineer, and he was the first one in his family to go to college. Came back to Ohio State and got his degree with the GI Bill, and then he decided he wanted to see the world. And so in the early 1970s, my mom and dad and 4 kids under 10 years old, we moved to Libya, Africa. And he worked for Exxon there. And then when my older brother got old enough, school only went up through 8th grade. And so when it was old enough that he would have had to been sent to Europe to go to school. We're from Ohio. We don't send our kids to Europe.
Kids to Europe if you're from
so
Ohio.
we moved back to the States, but then we lived in southern Maryland and then Utah and then back to Ohio. And so it's funny, all of my siblings graduated also from the Ohio State University, but they moved to a town and they've been there ever since, right? 20, 30 years. Whereas I have never, the house that I live in now with my husband and children is the longest I've lived in any house ever in my whole life. But it's funny, my parents say, we just don't know where you get it. I was like, well, should we look back at the photo album? Because they really provided this opportunity to see the world and reflect back at the United States. And so my undergraduate degree is in international studies. I knew I wanted to do that, but I didn't really think about gender equality until I was in my undergrad years. I actually became radicalized in the sorority system.
Well, that's what I think of when I was in a sorority, was radicalized. Thank you. I'll have to now put that on my resume.
Well, I thought there are twice as many fraternities as sororities at Ohio State. And so I thought if the sororities enforced the policies around drinking and other issues, then the fraternities would have to follow suit if they wanted to do social things with the sororities. So I was organizing, and then I ran to be the president of all the sororities, the Pan-Hel president, and I just ran, that was my first campaign. So I really liked it, and then I got my master's degree in public policy and women's studies. I moved to Washington to do policy, and I worked on, my master's thesis was on women running for office and how their experience was different than men's. And now we talk about it all the time. But way back then, in the early 90s, it was the first research that I've ever seen where I actually interviewed the women candidates and asked them, did you think about how you were treated differently or the same as the men you were running against? So I did that, and I was going to become a political science professor. But I'd never worked on a political campaign, and my best professors had always been those who did what they were teaching. One of my political science professors at Ohio State was the lobbyist for Ohio State. And so really hearing from him about what it was really like, I thought that I should go out and work on a campaign. But I loved it so much. Campaigns are amazing in the fact that you go onto the campaign, and if you're willing to work hard, there's very little hierarchy.
Exactly.
So you can move up very quickly. My first campaign, I was the 25th staff person in seniority, and my second one, I was the finance director, and I became the campaign manager. And so I really liked that. I loved, being from Ohio, where we're big football people. I don't have to tell you guys that. I like a clear
win.
win
In this conversation, can you tell?
I like a clear win. I like it,
yes.
The whole policy idea of working for years and then in the end compromising on a bill, I thought, where's the victory in that? So I really liked politics, and so I moved across the country once again, Kentucky, Ohio, Missouri, Arizona, Tennessee, working on political campaigns.
Do I remember that you met your husband in Kentucky?
Arizona.
Arizona, okay,
Yes.
see, it's been a while, but I remember odd things. I knew she found a husband somewhere on the campaign trail.
On the campaign
yes.
trail, much to the horror of my parents. Not that he's a lawyer. He, of course,
yes.
was taking a break from being a lawyer to work on a political campaign, but he was not from Ohio. So, it was one setback right there. But so we moved to Washington, and I started helping work on political campaigns from Washington. I decided that I should settle down and not be able to move all my stuff in my car and settle down a little bit. And so we both moved there and got married. And actually, I was having Easter dinner with a friend of mine, and his sister was there. And she said, you know, I think my boss is going to run for the Senate. And I thought, well, it's kind of late in the election cycle. But she said, can you come in and talk to him? Because he's been in his House seat for 8 cycles, 16 years, and he's never run for the Senate before. So can you just give him some advice what to do? So I went in and I called my husband on the walk back, and I said, that was remarkably like a job interview. But I have to remind this woman's name's Caroline that I have a house, I have a husband, that I don't want to go. I'm supposed to be not working on political campaigns anymore. So needless to say, a week later, I started on that campaign, that Senate campaign, and a week after that, I found out I was pregnant with my first child. And because it was only about 6 months before Election Day when I started that job, I took it. I went back and forth. My husband stayed in DC. He kept the What to Expect When You're Expecting book. And so I had to call him if I had any questions. And you know, I was 7.5 months pregnant on Election Day.
Now, what campaign was this?
This was Bob Clement for
Okay.
U.S. Senate.
In Tennessee.
In Tennessee.
Yes.
And so that really put all this work, because when you're on a political campaign, you always know how many days it is until Election Day. Because there are 3 resources in every campaign: people, time, and money. You can always get more money, you can always get more people, but you can never get more time. And so this idea of being so focused on that particular goal for however long you're on the campaign. I think my longest campaign was 18 months. My shortest was about 3 weeks. Really focused on it. But when you're pregnant, there's a lot going on in here. I mean, I remember one meeting where they were arguing about the color blue for our signs. And I was like, you guys just figure it out, because I am super hungry and I am not feeling well, so I trust you on the blue, you know? So I did that, moved back to DC, started working in politics, but based in DC. I had 2 children, a girl and a boy, born in the same election cycle, so I didn't have to take extra time off. They're already in therapy over that. But there's an illness that you get being on campaigns, the campaign bug, and it's like you're a carrier, and every once in a while it's reactivated, and you feel the urge, I feel the urge to go out and be involved in campaigns. So I did that, and then ended up at Emily's List, where I got to really focus on women running for office. And in that, I focused on women running at the state and local level, because although Emily's List was founded to help with women raising money for political campaigns, what we have now discovered is that money is no longer the #1 factor. Obviously, it's very important in US politics, and that is unique to the US, but now incumbency is the #1 predictor. And so an open seat is like gold. So we were working at the state and local level to work with women to run for state office, run for governor, so that when those open congressional, Senate, and presidential seats opened up, we would have a pipeline of women willing to run and be good at running. So that was very humbling, but also empowering. I would sit across ping pong tables in people's garages, and you know, basically it was the woman, her husband, and best friend, and they were running this campaign. And you know, when you run for Congress, people call you and say, how can I help? But when you're running for, you know, state rep in Iowa, you know, people aren't lining up to see how they can help. And so that really helped me. I did become cynical about US politics, because we were always looking for that open seat. And so keeping a list of all the members of Congress and their age is a very cynical way to think about when is that next seat opening up.
Yes, I've done that.
So I had the opportunity to go work for the National Democratic Institute. NDI is part of the National Endowment for Democracy. There are 4 institutes: the Democratic Institute, the Republican Institute, Labor Institute, and Business. And it was formed by Ronald Reagan, and the idea that these 4 institutes would work around the world, and if we could have strong political parties, strong labor, strong business, that would come together to form democracy.
and I'll just, because Ronald Reagan when he launched the National Endowment for Democracy, he said, we have the Peace Corps to teach people how to grow things. We need to help people grow democracies. And it was the essence of President Reagan. And it has just done such great work. And just a sidebar, even though it's called National Democratic Institute and International Republican Institute, which was, the chair was Senator John McCain, we work together. The missions are the same. A lot of times we're in the same countries. I've done a lot of work for both organizations. So even though there may be a political party, it is not a partisan. It is, we teach people messaging, communications, or as I was telling the student reporter earlier, these are countries that didn't have 7th grade student council elections. They did not grow up like I did, being in student council in 2nd and 3rd, all during elementary school. These are people that are really just fresh, and for our perspective to come in on, here's what a civil society can look like. And so thank you for letting me just a little bit more of a sidebar, because I think sometimes they think that we're partisan when we're really just teaching skills.
Exactly, and the importance of democracy across the whole spectrum. And so also Republican and Democrat don't mean anything. When you have 37 political parties in your country, once we leave the United States, whether it was IRI or NDI, we were often partnering. For instance, in Bosnia, when I was there, the National Democratic Institute was working with women candidates, and the IRI was working with women in parliament who were already elected. And so we were working on two sides of the same puzzle there. So I was in charge of women's political participation there, got to travel around the world helping women not only run for office and serve in office, but also the role that they could play as citizens, as voters, in civil society, holding their government accountable to the promises they'd made during the last campaign. And then another point about that is, the other thing about that is we are not there to export US democracy. Our system is very different. But we have more elections than any country. There was one yesterday in Alabama. There's one about once a month, and somewhere in the United States at some level. But a lot of the countries where we work, they have one election every 5 years. And everything from the president to the parliament to, if there are governors or any local councils, everything's elected the same day. So it's more that we say, this is what we've seen work in the US, this is what we've seen work in other countries, what would work here? And so really try to work through that political process,
political
as opposed to,
Yes, I never want to be the one that says, I'm from Washington and I know everything, right? I was always very, I want to hear how we can tailor what we know and how it can benefit you. Or as I like to say, when I go to Mongolia and Nigeria and everywhere, they always would want to dress me up in their native costumes and take photos of the goofy American dressed like a Mongolian warlord. And so I always say that's what I really did to bond with these people, because I was not I'm the smartest one in the room. I am here to help you. And I think that's always really important, because we have this impression that we know everything, and we don't. It's very different. And speaking of elections, there are 517,000 elected officials in the United States. Let that sink in, 517,000. So if we were from Florida, you can actually run for mosquito board. But I always remind people that your goal is to kill the mosquitoes, not represent them. And so, but every time I'm in Florida around election time, I always have, we always have to stop the car so I can take a picture of the mosquito board yard sign, because it's only in America would somebody run for mosquito board. But it is, and so I think to Susan's point, we elect everything. In Texas right now, I've had a grad student work all year because no one knows how many elected offices are in Texas, because about 20 different entities keep count. The Secretary of State does not know. So she has been working diligently just to find out, because there are so many different elections. So, but to go back to how do we tailor what we know and to be helpful is not that we are here to go, it's our way or the highway.
Exactly, especially with regard to women's representation.
Absolutely.
Because in the world, the US is actually ranked 78th in the world for the percentage of women at our national level. There are 77 countries, including Rwanda and Cuba and others, that have a greater percentage of women. And so especially with that, it's a co-learning. I'm trying to take what we've what we've learned here and help women run for office, but then learn from their experiences and try to help women in the U.S. as well.
Well, when you look at Rwanda, which is the #1 in the world for women's representation, a lot of the countries we work in have a women's quota. Now, we could probably never do this in the U.S., but in many countries, had there not been a quota, no woman would even be there. And it has some challenges, but in Rwanda, it was so remarkable. I don't remember what the original quota was, 20% or
20
something.
or 30.
20. And now, of 100 representatives in their parliament, 67 are women. And once they first elected women using the quota system, they went, wow, these women know how to function. They're doing a really good job. And then they more than doubled their numbers. So it's remarkable. And some of the places where the quota system is a bigger challenge because the husband or the political party is calling all the shots, right? They've put a woman up as a puppet. Mexico had a 50%. I was there a few years ago working, and they had all of a sudden decided they wanted a 50% quota for women. And I went down and trained a couple hundred women, but they were almost just walking around looking for women, and which is not the best way to recruit. I want a woman who already has a strong background in civic engagement or community activities, and not somebody that's going to be, listening to what other people tell her to do. And I think that's always part of the challenge when people go, ooh, we should have a quota system here.
Mm-hmm. Or they don't actually want to implement it.
Correct.
Right? They pass it because the international community has pressured them.
Right.
And so then in Mexico, they also had women running, and then after the election, they would resign, and her husband would take her place.
Right.
And so they would fulfill the quota, but not really the spirit of it.
And so that's always the challenge, because when we look at some of these countries that say, oh my gosh, there are more women in office in some of these places, well, yeah, it's a dictatorship. They really don't have a voice. Mm-hmm. But it looks good on paper that they have a higher percentage of women than we do.
Right.
But to go back to your,
NDI. Sorry, we digressed.
We digress.
So then I had the opportunity, I got a call from the White House, which is always nice, and they said we have a new position at USAID. It's the Senior Gender Coordinator for the agency. So USAID has been dealing with gender issues and empowering women since it was founded, back by President Kennedy. But in the past 15 years had started to focus more on issues of gender throughout the work. Mm-hmm. So it started out as women and development. How can we make sure that women are part of the development work we do? Then it moved towards women in development. So now maybe we should ask women what they want instead of assuming. I mean, one simple example is, for a long time, USAID gave out rice in 50-pound bags, which was great if there was a male-headed household. But if a woman tried to go literally just pick up the rice and bring it home, that was very hard. So just asking, do you need 50 pounds of rice? How might you get that home? What would be maybe rice
Logistics.
And oil? And I mean, just asking women what would be useful for their households. And then it has moved now towards gender and development, where we're thinking about men and women and the different roles they play in society. Because once again, if you just go in and assume what the roles of men and women are in these countries and not take that into account in the help that you're giving, you might be perpetuating bad actions that are taking place there, roles in society, and that sort of thing. So at USAID in 2013, they had a new gender policy, which was about the programs that we did and how to take gender into account. It held everyone at the agency accountable for that. Everyone had to take a Gender 101 course to understand what that meant for their work. And then my job was to kind of run an internal campaign explaining how the gender policy was actually going to make their work more impactful. So we would have a better impact and work with the beneficiaries of the programs, but it would also be more sustainable over the long run. Just one quick example on that. When the Ebola crisis broke out, my first instinct was to go. And of course, my family was like, you're not going, you have no medical background. And but the idea was that we were getting calls from women. There was a huge trading network of women along the river that connected the three countries. And they were getting reports to us that women were dying in much higher numbers from Ebola because they were the first people. When you got sick, you went to your mother, you went to your wife and said, I don't feel well. So before she even knew what it was, she was caring for these people who were going to die. And so I sent an email to our task force on Ebola, and I said, are we collecting any data on men and women dying from Ebola? And the email response I got was, we are treating all the victims of Ebola. And I was like, I know you are, and I know you're in a very stressful place, but I just want to know, have we seen any gender aspect of this because of the role women play in these communities? And it turns out, after a year, I finally found out that actually men and women were dying in fairly similar numbers because the men did the burials. And so once again, they were putting themselves in situations where they were getting the disease because of their role there. So sometimes there's a gender difference, and sometimes there's not. But if you don't even ask the question, you're not going to know how men and women and boys and girls might be impacted differently. So my great idea of going to USAID was to connect the political to the rest of the development world. So people who are doing education and energy and global health, because oftentimes they don't want to do the democracy stuff. They're like, that's kind of like politics.
Yeah, that's poli-sci.
They're like, oh, that's kind of dirty. And so my idea was to explain to them that if we didn't have good governance in some of these countries, right? If elections weren't free and fair, if they didn't know that the government was going to actually pay the teachers that they'd been training or go to the schools that they built, then why are we doing all this development work?
Right.
And my idea for the political people was that because NDI and IRI, I love them, but this idea that politics existed on its own without everything else going on. I mean, working around the world trying to recruit women to run for office, I often say it was like asking them to fly to the moon, but they had to build their own rocket ship. Because their day-to-day life, I mean, they were getting up hours earlier than their husband, literally walking miles to get fuel or water, making breakfast, ironing the clothes, and then the husband woke up and it was like a little elf had been there and all this work had been done. And then working outside the home, we were asking women, oh, you can grow a garden, or you should have economic opportunity and start a small business. And then we're like, and we need you to run for office. I mean, we call it the third shift because it was crazy. And so the political people who were like, why aren't more women running? You go and you train them and they don't run, because we were not taking care of their food insecurity.
Right.
They didn't know that their kids were safe going to school, or that they would have enough energy or light, electricity to get through the night. And so they didn't think that it would make a difference in their lives, and they didn't think it was worth the time to do this third shift. And so my idea was to build that bridge between the two parts of the agency. What I did not realize was that you don't really get to control your own agenda when you're a political appointee, and that the administrator of USAID and the president and the first lady come and say, hey, I want to do this. And you say, okay, let's get it done. And so I had the great opportunity to work on fantastic programs like Let Girls Learn, which Mrs. Obama worked on, the African Leaders Summit, where President Obama brought leaders from across Africa together. I was able to travel with Dr. Jill Biden when she did a trip every summer. She maintained her full teaching schedule as Joe Biden's wife, the vice president's wife. So she taught at a community college in Virginia, just as she always had when she was in Delaware. But every summer she took a trip. And because she cared very much about women and girls around the world, I got to represent USAID and explain some of the programs that we were doing. So I was very thankful for that, but I never really got to connect that bridge between the development and the political folks.
It's so difficult. I remember, speaking of Africa, there was a story in the Washington Post from years ago that I always saved, and it was about how more women were actually running for office in various countries, whether it's Nigeria, Kenya, all these different countries. And they interviewed a man going, well, I don't think she should be running for office. Who's going to collect the dung so we can buy, who's going to build the hut, and who's going to feed the children and birth them, and carry the water 20 miles every day, and the 50-pound bags of rice. But it was just so remarkable on when we talk about what does gender equity mean and how much more work women do just to make their lives run in other countries. I mean, obviously women we do a lot here, not that we love men, but we do a lot here, but just in other countries, a lot of the men don't even work. They, they'll just be under the tree all day, chewing whatever I can't remember what it's called. Is it called? Cot. Yeah, they chew, there's this big, they chew something that kind of has a medicinal effect all day. How's that for my way of saying that? But it was always such a remarkable article to read on the pushback on, who's going to run my life? And of course, that's what we deal with a lot of times. I've always said, working in the Middle East with a lot of these women from Jordan and elsewhere, they always go, well, what do you think we should do? And I said, do you think you can teach your son how to make a sandwich and do his own laundry? Because I think that'll really go a long way for changing your life, not this generation, but maybe the next generation, because you're their mother, not their slave. And I think that in many places where we work, that's the little boys don't have to do anything.
Yeah. Well, that's actually something that I found surprising when I traveled, especially when I first started doing a lot of international travel. My children were younger.
Yes.
And so, maybe I was there for 4 days. The first day, they listened politely, to the white woman from the U.S. And then, they're like, oh, this is going to be kind of a co-creation where we're discussing. She's not lecturing at us, which is very unlike how their schools are.
Right.
And whenever we have exercises where we all get to share our ideas, I found it much more useful for everyone in the room. But about the third day during one of the tea breaks, and there's always lots of tea breaks, they would say, are you married? Do you have kids? I'd say yes, and they'd say, well, how are you here? And what they meant was, how are you doing it? How do you balance your work with all the things that you have to do at home? And so I'd say, well, my husband's there. Alone? I was like, yes. Your mother is not there? I was like, no, he's all by himself. Well, what are they eating? And at first when I traveled, I did try to make meals. I don't know what I was thinking, and
well,
then
you're from Ohio. Come on.
I am. I have a lot of Tupperware.
We have a lot of
freezer.
Tupperware things in the freezer. We have casseroles.
Yes.
We're from Ohio.
But then I realized, my husband has an ATM card like everyone else. He can eat out as much as he wants. And so, but they wanted that,
Yes.
that issue of time and care was so universal. And so I had to let go and let my husband do it his own way, but I could let go, and that he was supportive and, very happy for me to do this work.
Because we don't run into this. I remember working with a candidate in Nigeria who was a member of parliament there, and her husband left her.
Yeah.
Because she wanted to run. So I think it's much more dramatic, or the family will shun her because she wants to be in public. And so it's such a difficult situation. Or as I like to say, let me tell you what a real war on women looks like. Because we have a voice and power here in the U.S. And so I think it's just always extraordinary in why this gender question comes up, despite many of my friends going, oh, Nancy, you and your gender stuff. And I go, well, really, there's a reason we do this.
Yeah, there is. And there was actually a piece in today or yesterday's New York Times about a woman. There were just elections in Afghanistan. And she's the first woman elected to be mayor of her town. And the title of it is, first mayor fully expects to be assassinated. I mean, because she has stepped out of her role and she's not hiding. She actually is trying to clean up the city and do other things that she ran on. But the gender bias is so strong there that when the Taliban, or if the Taliban comes back, she will be a target.
One of my mentees from Afghanistan, who is on the town council, city council in Kandahar, I asked her, because I always was worried, she has 5 guards with her at all times. And while she was here for a program, her house was broken into, things were stolen, her computer, and she's now staying in the U.S. seeking asylum because it has just become too unsafe. And she's only 25. She wanted to go create change there. And it is, and we talked about Afghanistan a couple of weeks ago, but it is, yes, I read the same article that, you go in with this, I'm going to try the best I can. I know I will be assassinated, and what a horrible way to have to serve.
Yeah. But it's just, obviously Afghanistan is a somewhat extreme, but the violence against women, either intimidation or outright violence against women in many places around the world, not just running for office, but taking any sort of public leadership role. And a lot of the polling that we see is that men and women don't think women should be in leadership, right? Women aren't born thinking, yes, I should be in leadership, and everyone. We're all born in the same society with the same pressures on what's appropriate for a man and woman to do in these various regions. And so working with women and men to think that women can be in leadership, because it does make all the difference. As you were referring to Rwanda before, in India, they put a quota on the local council. And in India, there are so many local councils that when it went into effect, literally 1 million more women were in office at the local council than had been before. But now they're doing studies 5, 6, 7 years later where places where the women were actually allowed to serve and be active members of their local councils, there are more girls in school. Because it changed their attitudes about the value of these girl children, that they could grow up and be part. So it's for the women themselves, it's for their communities that they make a difference, because they bring a different perspective, not because they're better, they're just different than men. They have different priorities, you know. But then they could see that these girls, keep them in school because they could grow up to help our community.
I remember one of my favorite sayings by Sally Ride is, you can't be what you don't see. And often when I would go over to various places, women from Indonesia and other places had never seen a woman even speak in public before. And just how empowering that was, that you actually are doing this. And they felt more, you know, they just felt like they had found their voice, that it's okay to have an opinion. And of course, in Colombia, and I remember reading this story, corruption. Susan and I are talking, usually every country we go to, we ask, what is the biggest challenge facing your community? And it's always corruption. And then you have to peel the onion back. Okay, what does that mean? Well, the government says the water's drinkable and it's not. Or, you know, everything is under the table. I have a dear friend in Russia who mother, father, and stepfather all had cancer in a year and a half. And when they were in the hospital, the orderlies would not change the linen or the bedpans unless there was money under the table. And most of the world operates this way. And so it's asking those questions. But in Colombia, the police were so corrupt. Like anything is a traffic, right? I've been in many countries where people with guns just decide they're a policeman, or they could be a policeman, and they see a white person in the car and they'll pull us over and say, oh, you were going 36 miles an hour instead of 35, where's our money? And it was quite intimidating the first time that happened. And then finally at the end of the trip, I just got out and would pose with the guys, because why not? But you know, in Colombia, it was so bad that they decided to have women be police officers who were traffic cops. And the corruption just went away almost overnight. It is a really remarkable story on Add Women, Change Everything, as Marie Wilson used to say, who founded the White House Project. So we do look at things a little bit different, and we do look at this whole corruption. Not that women are not corrupt, it's just that we seem to have different priorities.
Yeah, I agree. One story about raising your voices, we had a program in Pakistan, and we were trying to get the participants, the women, to give us their opinion about things, and they would not speak. We would say, I mean, little things, like, should we take a tea break, right? And we were trying to build up to what, because often we work with women of many different political parties at the same time. And the goal is to say, because they are under a lot of pressure from the political party leaders, but what do you want this country to look like in 10 years? Can we create a shared vision of that and then figure out how to get there? But start with that shared vision. So do we think it's everyone can read, or girls stay in school longer, or cleaner water, whatever it is? But they would not speak. So we had these two plastic, almost like cardboard with laminated, a red hand and a green hand. And then they would just hold them up. And that's how we kind of eased them into, like, it's okay to voice your opinion. You don't even have to speak, just raise the green or the red hand. And I still have them at my house because I carried them around. Just if we have to get to this again, that's okay, but the idea is that your voice matters and that it's an important part of the discussion. And so meeting them where they are and helping them get to that bigger conversation about their country and their community.
I remember when you went to USAID, and I went over to hear you speak one day, and you were telling the story as I was doing the promo session about Susan coming, were these stories about what happened in Jordan. And I always, and it's been years ago, but I always just remembered those vividly. So if you could tell us the power plant and the door-to-door stories, because they really are remarkable.
Yes, so we had a big program at USAID around energy and making sure that countries that don't have energy on a regular basis, with electricity and all these things, that we would bring energy and electricity to countries. But part of it was we also wanted to have women as part of the decision making, where the plants were built, who was getting electricity first, all these sorts of things. And then women working in the sciences, because in many countries, if you're going to send anyone to school, but specifically a girl to school, she better have hard skills, right? There's no philosophy majors, right? In Africa, they're science, they are math, they are doctors, they are leading towards income generation. And so how do we get more women in the energy sectors? Do we have mentors? So I went to see a power plant that we had built, and there was no women's restroom. And I thought, how could you build a power plant? And they said, well, we've never had any women work here. And I said, you know how you're going to ensure that no women ever work here? Is if you don't have a bathroom for them. I mean, it was crazy, this idea.
It's what comes first, the chicken or the egg, right?
Yes.
It is just phenomenal. That never thought about. We never had them before.
Right. Just to say, in our country, there wasn't a women's restroom on the floor of the House of Representatives until the last 30 years.
Right, until the early 80s. So
yes.
I do remember that. So to be fair, I was going to point that out.
That's outlandish. And then the other thing about kind of some of the arguments, or I wouldn't say advocating, that I did at USAID, that it would make your program more impactful. So there was a place that we were trying to measure energy usage, and much like in many places where you go door to door and ask to read the meter that's in the house or the apartment and that sort of thing. And in Pakistan, they were sending men to go around and read, because of course they were employing the men, that was the good thing to do. So to read the meters, they would knock on the door, and women would not let them in the house. I mean, that would be completely taboo for a man to be in the house when there's no other men there, just with women and girl children there. And so they weren't getting the readings. We had no way to measure electricity consumption. And so, brilliant idea, why don't we hire women to go door to door to do this? They could go in twos if that makes everyone feel more comfortable, but they would have access. And the older gentleman who had been running this program was so convinced. We put him on a promo tour around USAID, talking about when you actually took gender roles into account. It made their program so much more effective. They could get the data that they needed. And so, whereas he had thought that gender had nothing to do with it, when he took a step back, it really changed the program. And then one other example was in Yemen. I had the great fortune to go there 4 or 5 times before the latest civil war, and during that time there was a national dialogue around peace. And my first time I went, I argued to get a quota so that 30% of the delegates would be women. And then we went back to train the women, and the goal was that they would be trained on what they wanted to advocate for on women's issues, but they would also sit on every other committee and help. And so they were ready to go. And in Yemen, these national dialogues of about 500 people would take place in a huge hotel ballroom. There was really only one hotel in Sana'a that would hold it, but it was just rows and rows and rows, and they'd all come in and sit down, and then whoever was leading it would be up on this stage in the front. And the women were there. They were on time, which if you're on time in Yemen, you're about 2 hours early. But they were there, they had their notes, they knew what committees they were on, they were ready to go. About 2 hours in, these warlords come in, often with men with guns are escorting them. And they said, you're in our seats, because the women had sat down in the front row. And then women said, no, these are our seats, because we were here on time. And if you want these seats, then you need to come earlier. But we were here, and these are our seats. And so, although the national dialogue did not end as we wanted, and since then the country has fallen way back into civil war, their minds had changed. They were no longer going to stand up and move to the back of the room. They had something, they had a valuable input to give on the national dialogue, and they were going to hold their seats. And so that was such a great moment, because that's something that didn't come from me.
Right.
It came from them, and it was going to change their country in the long run. So it was heartbreaking. But at the time, I felt like we were on such a good path.
So Obama leaves office, you're out at USAID, and all of a sudden you and Stephanie Foster decide to create a group called Smash Strategies. Is this smashing the patriarchy, smashing ceilings? Is it just using smash in general?
We're smashing everything, really.
That's what I thought.
But we had actually met in December 2015 and decided that we were not going to work in government anymore. She had been actually, my business partner had been at the embassy in Kabul in Afghanistan for a year before she came back to Maine State. And we had both been our own business people before we kind of joined these larger bureaucracies. And then we'd been in the second largest bureaucracy ever after the UN. And decided that we wanted to go back to kind of having control over our own lives and controlling that. So we met once a month throughout 2016. We met on a Saturday or Sunday at one of our houses, and we did the market research, and we decided what our partnership agreement would be, and we had actually filed our papers for our LLC and got them back on October 30th of 2016. And so we knew that we were going to do it either way. But it was great that once January came, we were ready to go.
Right.
So we wanted Smash because we wanted it to be bold. We didn't want to think that we were doing something the same old. And we wanted to also reclaim our, as kind of middle-aged women, getting out there and doing something important that we really cared about.
So you have now created this program for UN women, because you were in Moldova, I just think like 2 weeks. You had just left Moldova when I came, but
yes, yeah.
we were kind of, I think we waved at each other almost at the airport. But talk to me, I know you piloted it there, and you really are bringing this curriculum to many other countries. So tell us a little bit about how you developed this curriculum and what you plan to do and how the UN's using this.
So I'm really excited about that. It actually took us over 18 months from the time that I was hired to write the materials. Since I was just in Africa, we were joking that it took as long as an elephant baby, because you're pregnant for 18 months if you're an elephant. So the idea was that at UN Women, they have country offices around the world, and when they were working to train women to run for office in these countries, every country developed their own materials. And so there was no kind of consistency. They weren't sure. Sometimes they didn't even get copies of the materials back in New York. So this idea would be that they would have a set of materials which would be fully global, but encourage everyone from each office to make it their own. So insert current local knowledge here. But they had some key things they wanted to say. And I think it was very exciting for me because it was two aspects of it which I had never done before, although I've been training women to run for office for over 2 decades. The first was that we wanted to teach transformational leadership. So that in teaching that, we don't want just women to run for office and then become like a man and represent what he would want. We want her, through running for office, to transform who she is, see herself as a leader, change attitudes in her community about what it means for a woman to be a leader. And then once she gets elected, change the institution which she is in. Whether it's parliament or the local council, it was generally created by men and for men. So this idea, for instance, in some countries where women have a greater percentage now, they've changed the dates that parliament meets to match the school calendar, so that when they're not working, their kids are not in school. And so just things like that. They can't have meetings that require a quorum after 8 o'clock at night. Just being realistic about how women's lives might be different and trying to do away with some of those smoke-filled back rooms. So this idea of transformational leadership, that we actually encourage and think about what it means to be a transformational leader. The second thing is, in many cases, the training materials that I have used before for women candidates never said, you're running as a woman, how is that different? And so in these materials, we really talk up front about what it's like. As I've said to many candidates, running for office is not going to make your marriage better, right? It's hard. You're away from home a lot, right? You are spending a lot of time thinking about people that you don't live with. And so how does that change the dynamics in your house? How are your kids going to deal with it? Your personal life will be asked about, whether you're married or not married, have kids, don't have kids. I mean, everything is fair play. You know, what is it like? Do you show pictures with your children in your direct mail or not? Do you play up? Do you run as a woman or do you not? And so this is also, I think, a big change because I tended to think, I can't believe it, but that running for office was gender neutral. And even though we don't
gender, it's,
right,
yes.
it's not, right? And the press treats you differently, voters can treat you differently, and women need to think about things in a slightly different way. When I was at Emily's List, we actually did a great research where we had a woman and a man, both actors, say the exact same thing about defense, taxes, and immigration. And then we looked at focus groups, and they thought the men were strong and the women were weak. They said the exact same words. And so thinking about just where we come from as voters, what we see on the screen and how we can take some of that into account. And so the UN Women thing, we created a whole set of 200 pages of both instruction as well as a workbook for candidates so that they're doing exercises and they hopefully come out of it with a campaign plan. We wrote it, we tested it in Moldova and Nigeria. Then I used it for the very first time in Turkey before their local elections that just took place this past January. And then I just got back from Kenya, where we trained trainers, 16 women and 4 men from 7 different countries who are now going to take the materials that we trained them on, and they're going to go out and train women in their countries. The women from Sudan and Ethiopia were so excited because there's such big changes happening there. So hopefully before the end of the year, I will also be going to Ethiopia to kind of jumpstart that because there's such opportunities. So it's been wonderful. It's not going to be something that just sits on a shelf, but they're going to take it, and people are already starting to train using it. And so it's been a great example of how I think of my life's work is that I just throw a lot of little pebbles into the river and then the ripples go out. And so I hope that training program is something that will really lead to great change in countries across the world.
Well, it is. It's so exciting because I know for NDI and IRI, many of us have had conversations on how do we standardize what we're teaching because both organizations hire consultants, or they don't even hire. Many of us just have volunteered over the years. They pay for our expenses, but if I was in Russia in 1994, and I did the very first Women's Leadership Conference in Petrozavodsk, Russia, and it was about 20 below zero. So it was quite the experience. But women from different nonprofits all came together just to learn basic organization, fundraising, advocacy, and it always depends on who is available to volunteer at the time. And just because I've learned a long time ago, just because you're really smart doesn't mean you're a good teacher. It is 2 different skill sets. And so I'm just so excited that we have something that is a curriculum, not just what somebody thinks. And it's tested.
Yes, and we started with a huge set of over 100 sets of materials from all over the world. That's how we came up with the first draft. And then we had a lot of good feedback, like you can't use the phrase stump speech because that's a very American phrase. And what do you mean by formal versus informal? And things like that, where we got a lot of great things that we just thought that were common were just really not.
Yeah, I remember
But
in Russia.
we have that a lot in our work, right? We use acronyms, we
do.
use.
It is. I remember the first time I was teaching in Russia and I was doing a communications, and I said, or communications training, and I said, well, sometimes you have to nip things in the bud. because who doesn't listen to Andy Griffith and Barney Fife for political advice? And my poor translator, it means to cause a spontaneous miscarriage or something, and it just threw him. And 20, it's 1994 to now, 25 years, he still talks about how he was trying to translate Nip It in the Bud. And now that he's been to the US and has watched Andy Griffith, he gets it. But back in 94, not so much. But it is very, we do speak in using just phrases that are American phrases. And so you always have to be very careful when you're overseas using as plain as language that's not confusing.
Yes, yes.
So I have to ask you, and then we'll go back, because I know we'll have to open it up for questions soon. So tell me, what do you remember about Libya as a child? Is there any memory?
It's hard to remember what I remember versus what the pictures that I've seen.
Yes.
So one thing is that the swimming pool, I mean, country club is a strong word, but the swimming pool that we went to had salt water. So I always thought I was this great swimmer. And then I came back to the US, and it was not nearly as buoyant as I had been before. So, so that, and then we also, I mean, the fact that there were ruins, like right outside of town. We lived in Marsa El Brega, which is a fairly small place, but we could just take a Sunday drive, and there were ancient ruins there. You could also see men still, racing wild horses, and I mean, the culture, especially in the early 70s, it was very still traditional outside our little enclave of Americans and Brits there. And so that, just that whole idea of how that we are not the center of the universe,
Correct.
that we were there in their country, and
Right.
how can we respect their wishes and their culture and that sort of thing. But then also looking back to the United States, and how do we, things that we take for granted that that's just the way it is, it's really not like that in any other country, and actually how do they see us, which I still find very useful to kind of get out of the day-to-day, front page newspaper, Twitter, all these sorts of things, is how are we seen, and what lessons can we learn, quite frankly, from how other countries have been successful around democracy and women's empowerment and that sort of thing.
Well, it's, as we've seen in the news in the last 36 hours, I know you've worked in Iraq, and you've worked with Kurds. And tell us a little bit, it's such a complicated history. I think there was an article in the Washington Post that said, here are 8 times we betrayed the Kurds. And of course, to no one's surprise, Turkey has now started the slaughter and can be a genocide. Tell us just some of the challenges, because I know just a lot of people don't understand or just don't know. Tell us a little bit about the culture, the differences, and how all of this is, how did they get to be in this tenuous position?
Well,
So let me tell you, yes, give us the history of the Middle East. So in 5 words or less. No.
well, I mean, it's obviously, part of the country that, I mean, for a long time, with Saddam Hussein and everything, I was trying to explain it to my children, and, this whole part of the country that, is different ethnicity, different ethnicity. Yes. They have their own resources. They wanted to become their own country, very much forced together. And then during this democratic process have had fits and starts of actually being able to create their own country, and given promises that if there was some sort of oil sharing, but have been very loyal to Americans in our work there over the past, over 15 years, being there and providing translators and keeping a safe space. There were many times when we could not, at NDI or USAID, get into Baghdad, and so we would work out of Erbil, still with armed guards, but still we could at least fly in and out without being shot down. And so such a unique, almost separate partnership than everything that we were doing in other parts of Iraq, and certainly when we were fighting ISIS in Syria, and helped us contain across Syria, and the gains that they had made in Iraq really helped. The Kurds helped us, standing side by side really thinking of ourselves as partners. And so if nothing else, just the fact that everyone from Franklin Graham to generals to people who have stood by the president for a long time are in unison saying how bad this is. I mean, it's horrific for the people, but it also just dampens our word going forward.
Yes.
Why would anyone else stand next to us in terrifically hard times when from one administration to the other there's no commitment that outlasts that? And so much like the women that I worked with in Yemen, who I can no longer communicate with, I just think about those young women. I did one program in Iraq, which was young women from across the country, and we brought together young women from all over the country, and some of them had never met Kurds before. And yet, of course, by the third day, we couldn't get them to quiet down to continue the workshop because they found that they had so much in common, and this joint view of what they wanted
Right.
Iraq to become, and the fact that all the lines are there, and that Turkey is really taking advantage of this is just. I also was in southern Turkey as part of this training, and so I was right across the border from Syria, where there were so many Syrian refugees
Yes.
there, and obviously you could see the pressure on public housing and transportation and the health system. And of course, lasting years now. So I could understand that pressure, and yet it's still, I think, not an excuse for
No.
what has happened.
Someone wrote back to me today on Facebook was that, and he is a Naval Academy grad, that we have left them in a worse position. It just reminded him of when we abandoned Vietnam in '75, and and his perspective was very telling, having watched that. And even before all this new crises had happened, I had rewatched Anthony Bourdain's special when he went to Kurdistan. And it was just fascinating. And they talked about it was the safest place he had felt. Everyone was glad we were there. People were speaking English. They have oil supply. I mean, they were just ecstatic. And now I feel like we've just abandoned them.
And I fear we're going to do the same in Afghanistan, with only negotiating with the Taliban as opposed to the government of Afghanistan. I have sat down with thousands of women, and the one woman has asked me for something, and she was in Afghanistan, and she said, I need you to take my daughter. She's 16. She has no memory of the Taliban. I lived through it once. I will live through it again, but I don't want her to know. And so this idea that we are negotiating just to get out with no thought about what's going to happen to the people who have helped us, but also people who have built their lives, thinking that we were going to, leave it better than we found it. It's really, it's a very sobering week.
It's very interesting. When I was I've been to Armenia twice in the last 2 years, and I did not realize that Aleppo is where the Turks banished all the Armenians. So there's so many Christians in Aleppo who were being slaughtered in Syria, and now I was meeting with the UN in Yerevan, and they're bringing them back. And just, I had always heard of the genocide in Armenia, but did not know that aspect because I had never worked in that country. But just the number of Christians, in fact, there was an article today on just the Christians who are going to be slaughtered in Kurdistan.
Yeah.
And just that it's going to be very telling because the Turks know how to do this. Not that I don't love Turkey; it is a beautiful country, but having seen the Genocide Museum, and I was there during the Week of Remembrance in Armenia because more than 2 million were killed, and what was very just lasting memory was there was in the museum they have this huge picture of Armenians on a cattle car. Now think about this. This is in the 20s. And Hitler actually had a quote that's in the Holocaust Museum who said, nobody cared when they put them on cattle cars in Armenia. No one's going to care what we do to the Jews. And that was where the fact that Hitler got the idea of putting humans on these cars, on these train cars, and shipping them away it was just an extraordinary moment. And I just feel like we are reliving parts of this. I don't mean to be so, but it's just it's all over my newsfeed today because all of us who do this international work, it's so painful to watch.
It is.
It's just, I'm trying to think of something on an upbeat note. To change, let me make everybody cry, and now we're going to change the conversation, the tone of, so what is so where's the most interesting place you've visited? I know you're asked this all the time.
I am.
I'm asked the same thing.
Because they're so different.
Yeah.
My older sister actually said, how are you so happily surprised every place you go? Why is anything still amazing to you? I don't know why, but it is, because every place is so different. I mean, in Kenya, since I was just there, there's a national park 10 kilometers outside Nairobi, and I was, like 5 feet away from a lion that was walking around. I mean, I saw elephants and everything in this national park. They've done such a great job with that, and I couldn't believe that I'd spent my week in a conference room with no windows when I was like, there was a lion right over there.
And down the street.
Yeah, and beautiful architecture, and people who've done such a great job with their history and culture, maintaining it, and the people. I mean, the people are what I remember, actually. I don't drink coffee, which is appalling universally, it's what I've learned. People, because no matter where I go, they're like, oh, try the coffee.
Because it's the best.
It's so different, and you're really going to like it here. So I've had coffee in almost every country where I've been, still don't like it, but they're proud.
Yes.
I mean, their country oftentimes is, not the safest place, but they're proud of their homes, they're proud of their children, they love their culture. I've never been in a country where there weren't enough women to run for office who had really good ideas. And so I think that they're willing to open up and share their lives with me and hear about mine. It's been incredible. I mean, I've seen rugged physical beauty. I've, had my hands painted for a wedding. It's just people.
Do they dress you up like they always seem to dress me up?
I do not go for that, no.
Oh my gosh. There are so many photos of me where they dress me up in some goofy outfit and they just love it. They love to have the headdresses and everything, and I just let them do it.
But it's amazing how different and big and how opening the world is, and we want all the same things.
And it is, and I think that's part of health and safety are the number 1 and 2 concerns of no matter where you go around the world. And it becomes simple in terms of what's important to people. It's not these huge concepts. It's no, I want a healthy environment and I want a safe place for my kids. And so when we have these meetings with diverse people, I was in Egypt 3 times after Mubarak was overthrown, and the second time we went, I was there with Peter Fenn, who must be 6'4", a big Democrat consultant, and there were 5 people that were sent from each of the political parties. And this is Muslim Brotherhood, you had Socialists, you had Democratic, but there were 75 people, 5 from each party. And first of all, the Muslim Brotherhood had just won the first round of elections, and they were really mad because they thought there should be more than 5, right? We just won some elections, we should have 20. And they wouldn't even sit with each other. Every group would sit by themselves. And Peter Fenn was great. He made them count off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and said, okay, now you have to go sit with yourselves. So then they complained about that for 2 hours. Well, I don't want to sit with some socialists. I don't want to sit. I mean, it was just like kindergarten, right? And then when we started doing the exercise, okay, let's talk about some issues like lack of clean water or the fact that the tourism industry was off by 90%. When I was going to the pyramids, it was just me and 2 friends. There were not thousands of people like it had been when my mother and I had been just a few years beforehand. So when you finally get them talking about, oh, we really do share a belief, right? It goes beyond religion. It is what can we do to make our world better? And but it's really hard for them to sit down and get past their perceived differences.
Right.
So they can actually talk about, what can we do to bring more tourists back? And I'm sure we've both have faced this in so many places.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say us too. We
Yeah.
have a hard time in the United States now seeing
Well,
past
yes.
this as well.
Well, thank you
So-
to Ellen DeGeneres and George Bush for
Right.
having that moment at the
Reminding us.
Cowboys game on Sunday that we can have.
Yeah.
Or as I like to say, I just want to have T-shirts that say we're not North Korea, right? Because nobody has to agree on anything. There's no one that is going to agree on 100%. And I think sometimes we have become so polarized that if you don't believe my way, then you're just dead to me. And there are obviously fundamental differences, but at the end of the day, we pretty much want the same things,
Right.
but we have forgotten to have a discussion about them.
We want health and safety.
Health and safety, everywhere I go.
Yep.
So, would you like me to open this up to some questions? Great, look forward to it.
We could catch up all day, so. Yeah.
Come on, we had a lot of questions. Okay, I'm looking for that hand. Do I have to give you a red or a green hand? And your name and where are you from?
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm from Wichita. And Susan, I was wondering how you decide your calendar for each year and what countries you want to visit and why specific, or how you choose.
So I do not determine my calendar for the year. I'm still planning trips for the rest of this year. My husband and I have a master calendar, and because he travels domestically, but he still travels, and so we try not to leave the kids. I mean, obviously we never leave them alone, but we try not to leave them too much with our families, our parents who come sometimes to stay when we both are traveling. But I really don't have a set, these are the places I want to go. Even at USAID, where I thought I would be able to do that, because my goal there was to congratulate and lift up the USAID missions that were doing very well on gender, and to go to the ones that were maybe needed a little encouragement. And so I had my whole list of where I was going to go, but really events greater than me determined where I traveled when I was at USAID. When I'm working with women in politics, I have to say the electoral calendar really determines a lot of where are their elections. If you're having one election every 5 years, right, you can't go next year. You have to go the year before the election. And so the electoral calendar has a lot to do with that. And but besides that, I mean, certainly different administrations have different focus. Certainly Africa was a major focus for President Obama. He started doing the Asia pivot near the end, and so we were working, I had a great opportunity to go to Japan and South Korea and talk about how we could work together, our development agencies in that part of the world, which we hadn't done as much in. So it really is not well planned out. I just try to not miss the most major holidays, even though I had to, for instance, miss my husband's birthday 2 weeks ago. But, I made the cake when I got home, and, it was all good. I think the thing that my family, because I've always done work that I care very much about, they know that about me. They have not tried to talk me out of it. And even my daughter, when she was little, someone said, they were at a christening for family friends, and a woman that I work with said, "Are you sad that your mom's not here?" And my daughter Zoe said, "Well, she wouldn't be gone if it wasn't important, And so she got it, right? She heard all the yammering that I do and yelling at the TV, and kind of, understood that I care very much, and I hope I'm making a difference, or I wouldn't be traveling. So.
Well, and your family hikes, so
Yeah.
I know about Susan's life because, of course, Facebook. So you're always hiking in D.C., Rock Creek Park, right?
Course,
But then,
yes.
don't
The
you go
largest urban park, even bigger than,
Central?
yeah.
Wow, who knew, in D.C. But also, don't you go out west and just unplug for a couple of weeks and climb mountains or something?
Well, at some point, we were talking about moving out of the country. My husband also does he does immigration, and I do this work, and we wanted our kids to to live outside the country, as I had had the opportunity to do. And of course they said, well, we haven't even seen this country. So we took 6 weeks, and we went up to Maine, and then we drove all the way out to Idaho.
Yes.
And camped, and much to my daughter's horror, hiked. And they got to see the country, and they got to, be in thunderstorms and ice and sweating and seeing lots of animals, and they really got to see the country. And so, yes, when I'm there, I'm there. It was actually, they were joking after the administration ended, we took time off in early 17, and because I had just done a lot with Mrs. Obama around Let Girls Learn, I said to my daughter, who's a teenager, I said, "You're my girl now." And she's like, "You're going to focus on me now?" I was like, "Yes." She goes, "Why can't you go help girls in another country? Why here?" But I'm all in now. And so, sometimes when I haven't traveled in a bit, they'll look at their watch and be like, "Aren't you due for a trip somewhere?" Because I think my husband tends to be more lenient on the protein to dessert ratio than I am, and so they like Dad's rules sometimes, and but they're so encouraging. And this past summer we went as a family to Ireland, and having these conversations about the political realities about the EU and Northern Ireland, and I mean, they have opinions and they aren't afraid to argue with us, and it's just so gratifying to see that they're able to look at the rest of the world and
have
think
absorbed everything, right?
Yeah.
That you have represented your whole life and
Yeah.
believed in.
Yeah, it's good to see.
Instead of just saying, "Yeah, I'm teenagers, I want you to go away." It's like they fully have embraced
Well, I
this.
mean, we have to make them put their phones face down and get
Yes.
rid of the Wi-Fi in order to have those conversations. But once they happen, it's really amazing.
It is, and to your point, you never know who's going to call. I was telling Bill earlier that I got an email the other day going, "Nancy, can you go keynote a speech in Argentina?" So I'm going to get on a plane one night at 7:30 p.m., and I arrive in Argentina at 7:30 a.m., and then I'm going to go give a speech, and then I'll come back on the Sunday night on an all-night flight. So it's just, you don't know who you're going to, path you've crossed. Because we do so much networking, you just never know who's going to call you and go, "Oh, Nancy, will you come to Paraguay?" And I'm going, "Oh, sure. Just send me the plane ticket." I have very little, beyond send me a plane ticket. I don't have very much that I worry about. I make sure I'm current on shots if I'm going somewhere exotic, but you just have to take advantage of these strange opportunities. But yeah, I never know where I'm going to be in 3 months.
Right. It's also good though to go to. I have enjoyed being able to go back to certain countries. In Afghanistan, I met with the same women 3 years in a row, and hearing what how their thoughts had changed about their own government and the prospects for women there. Like I said, in Yemen, I went many times over 2 years, and so to be able to really feel the differences. But I love going to a new country where I get to learn all this history that usually happened in my lifetime that I have been blissfully unaware of, to learn about the characters and how the history fit together. It's just this constant learning that I really enjoy as well.
Other questions? Good.
My name is Francisco from Lawrence. Maybe, given the wealth of experience that both of you have overseas on this, on the issue of gender and women's participation, if you circle that back to the U.S. experience, both of you today mentioned how we rank, 78th, 77th in women's participation. How do you explain that, given your reference point of your work? What are we missing if certainly we have many, if not all of the structural elements in place in this country, certainly high levels of freedom, empowerment, mentors, certainly. Why aren't more women participating in politics?
Well, I do think, as I mentioned before, the incumbency issue is very strong. If as an incumbent member of any elected body, you are more likely to be elected. To be kicked out is, and so when you have 80% of the people in elected office men, it takes a long time for incumbency to open those up. And then even places like California where they have term limits, women have a greater percentage of women in the state legislature there, but now it's filling the pipeline because when they get kicked out after 8 years, I mean, men and women are both term limited, but now we have to continue to find new women to fill those roles. And we thought term limits was the answer, but it just creates a whole separate issue. So I think part of it is this idea of incumbency and how do you compensate for that issue. I don't have an answer for that. I think the second thing is that that this idea of you can't be what you can't see. I mean, it's a pretty new phenomena. I mean, the first woman elected in her own right to the US Senate was in 1986. So I know that feels a long time for students, but like in our adult lifetimes, every other woman had served in the Senate had taken over for her husband or father or brother who had been killed or died in office. And so, I mean, that's fairly new, 86. In 2008, we get the Washington Post at home. Yes, I still read a physical paper, but because of Hillary in the primary and McCain's vice president,
Sarah Palin.
Sarah Palin, there was a woman on the front page of the paper almost every day speaking on national issues. And my daughter was only 5 at the time, but I showed her those pictures and I took her to rallies and held her up. I mean, I was very cynical, and yet I wanted her to see that. And it's changed a lot, obviously, in the past 12 years, but it's not that. We don't have decades going back. Women's roles, the important roles that they've played in US history, you have to dig to find them. People joke about Women's History Month, because every other month is Man's History Month.
Right.
And so, and more the stories are coming out, the important role women have played in war, in the press, as doctors, in science, the astronaut program. I mean, all of them, but we've had to dig for it. And so, and then I think finally is that I don't think people in the US are sure they want women leaders. I don't know why. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes me feel very sad. We feel like we have freedom and equality. We can walk pretty much where we want, even though I would say any young woman knows that you can't walk wherever you want in any city when it's dark outside. But we feel like we have freedom of movement. We can wear whatever we like, although sometimes I disagree with what people are choosing to wear.
Thank you. I thought it was just me.
But so we feel like we're free. When I go to another country and I can't leave the hotel without a guard, or I cover or wear a scarf over my hair, I feel that they can feel that. But overall, we are not equal. The laws are there, but we do not have pay equity, right? We are not paid equally. We are still thought of, and I think men and women in this country are still not sure how comfortable they feel. In many states across the country, there are more women in the state legislature, but they've never had a woman governor, right? So what is the difference between being the one, the governor, the president, the singular head, as opposed to being in the legislature? I think we're still getting used to the idea of what it means, and it's hard for us to talk about because it's literally there from the day we are born. We treat boy and girl babies differently because we were treated differently. And so how do we think about, encouraging our daughters to be strong and outspoken? I deal with this all the time because I want her to be a leader, but just not in my house. I just need her to do what I say in the house, but then out there, you go get them, girl. But how do we encourage her, when perhaps, my parents sent me very mixed messages about, please go out there and be the best. You can do whatever you want, but please be married and have children by 30, right? Because then that's socially awkward, for my mother. I got these mixed messages all the time. And so I think the US, and for a long time we thought like we have this all figured out. And we weren't really introspective about it. Now I know we are retrospective, but we weren't introspective about it. And so now we're actually having conversations that are probably overdue, much like, race as well, right? We're not post-sexist, we're not post-racist, we just need to actually continue to have conversations.
It is, and I think there's a study that is just quite telling that the confidence gap starts at age 6 between girls and boys. And it's not always explicit, it's some implicit, whether it's, I was a smart girl. I know, imagine. I was inquisitive and precocious. But it was hard because people went, oh, you're the smart one. I always felt ostracized because of your hand was up. And there are teachers that still today will call on the boys, right? And not necessarily the girls. And it's when you see I think it's a Pew Institute study that has that confidence gap on just the subtle ways. I always guest lecture at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas, and there was this young Asian girl that was just sharp as can be. But she couldn't come to my program that night because she was expected to go home by 4 o'clock to prepare dinner for her brothers. And so, we still are unwrapping and unpacking just some of these differences that do lead to this whole confidence gap. And that, women haven't even been voting 100 years in America, right? We're just at the 100th year mark now. And it goes back to Susan's point of the hidden historical figures. When I was a kid, I read all the time, I loved history, and it never occurred to me that there were people besides, Pocahontas and Sacagawea and Clara Barton. I mean, you know what? We learned, maybe 6 women who did anything in history? And now, as part of my role and my job at Texas Women's University, I am opening up a gallery of significant women in Texas politics and public policy, and learning that Texas was the 9th state in the country to ratify. It was the first southern state, and what women did to make that happen was phenomenal. I read a biography, it's a woman named Minnie Fisher Cunningham, and back 100 and some years ago, the trains were social media. So wherever the trains went in Texas, she would get on a train and go talk to women about voting. And just how this one woman, speaking of transformational change, really changed what Texas looks like. And and most people don't even know this. So I think that we go back to you can't be what you don't see, and many of us didn't know that we could be this. No matter how, my parents also said, you can go do something. Fortunately, I didn't have maybe they should have pushed that marriage and babies things, because I'm not very organized. It wasn't on my to-do list, so I just didn't get it done. But it is interesting that a lot of this is subtle. But it's difficult, and to the point, we still have a lot of countries that we are 77th or 78th because we don't have quotas. There are some lot of numbers out there, because you can't tell me women in Venezuela really have more rights than we do, right? It's a mess. So, but if you can throw 30% of them in their version of government, then they sound better. But it doesn't mean they're prepared to serve. One last question? No, we're done. I've just got the cut her off. Well, I hope to see you.
I get that a lot. You're lucky.
I know, especially because, I could talk to you all day. So next week, Sally Canfield. It will be great. She's like the youngest of 8 kids. I mean, it's really a phenomenon. Her mother is still alive, swims every day. She's 94. She goes water skiing. So I think we're just from good stock, because my mom's 94. But I hope to see you back. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure, and have a great week.
Yeah, thanks.